In 1890, an unmarried woman with a fortune was not free. She was a target. Every eligible bachelor, every ambitious mother, every distant cousin with debts saw her the same way, as a walking treasury that needed only a wedding ring to unlock. But some refused. They chose spinsterhood over surrender, independence over the altar, and in doing so, became the most dangerous women in America. Not because they rejected men, but because they rejected the entire script. This is the story of the Boston marriages and the heiresses who kept their names, their money, and their autonomy, and the brutal price they paid for it. Chapter 1. The Arithmetic of American Daughters. By 1885, every daughter of a railroad fortune knew the exact mathematical value of her virginity and obedience. The equation was simple. Marry well, and your dowry transferred to your husband the moment the marriage was consummated. Refuse to marry, and you remained in legal limbo, a perpetual minor in your father's household. The average dowry for a railroad heiress ranged from $500,000 to $2 million. That money bought more than a husband. It bought railroads, political appointments, European titles, and the silence of bankruptcy courts. The law called it coverture. When a woman married, her legal identity dissolved into her husband's. She could not own property. She could not sign contracts. She could not keep her own wages if she worked. She could not sue or be sued. Even her clothes belonged to him. If she inherited a fortune the day before her wedding, it became his the day after. The only exception was if her father established a trust, and even then, all male trustees controlled every dollar she spent. In 1880, the average American earned $400 per year. A railroad heiress might be worth 5,000 times that amount. She was not a person. She was a fortune temporarily housed in a female body, and marriage was the legal mechanism that transferred ownership from father to husband. Her consent was a formality. Her signature was a ritual. The outcome was predetermined. Consider the standard marriage contract of the era. The groom received complete control of all property, real and personal. The bride received a promise of support, undefined and unenforceable. If he squandered her entire inheritance on mistresses and gambling debts, she had no legal recourse. If she fled an abusive marriage, she became a criminal who had stolen herself from her rightful owner. The law offered her protection only after she was dead, and even then, only if her husband felt generous enough to leave her a widow's portion. This was not an accident of history. This was the entire architecture of Gilded Age wealth. Fortunes did not pass through daughters. Fortunes paused at daughters, then continued through the sons-in-law who married them. A daughter who refused to marry was not asserting independence. She was holding the family fortune hostage. She was a traitor to the dynasty, a saboteur in silk, a weapon aimed at her own bloodline. The pressure was constant and comprehensive. Mothers arranged introductions. Fathers threatened disinheritance. Brothers borrowed against their sisters' expected marriages. Family lawyers drew up contracts before courtship even began. Society columns tracked every eligible heiress like livestock at auction, noting her estimated worth, her bloodline, her marriageability. To be unmarried at 30 was to be diagnosed with failure. To be unmarried at 40 was to be erased. But some refused anyway. They looked at the equation and chose a different answer. This is what they were refusing. $500,000 transferred. $1 million dissolved. $2 million surrendered. Not to a partnership, but to a legal annihilation so complete that even their names would disappear. What they chose instead would make them the most hated women in their families and the most free. With Chapter 2, when Annie Leary chose the church over a husband. Annie Leary was worth $4 million in 1870, and her family spent the next 20 years trying to marry it away. Her father had made his fortune in hats, not the labor of making hats, but the genius of selling them to every head in New York City. When he died, he left everything to Annie and her sister, with one expectation embedded in every line of the will. They would marry men worthy of managing such wealth. The will did not say this explicitly. It did not need to. The entire legal structure of 1870 assumed it. The suitors arrived in waves. First came the appropriate matches, sons of merchant families with complementary fortunes. Annie refused them. Then came the ambitious matches, younger sons of minor European nobility willing to trade titles for capital. She refused them too. By 1875, her mother had resorted to desperate matches, in widowers twice her age, cousins with gambling debts, anyone willing to take the money and ask fewer questions about the woman attached to it. Annie kept saying no. Each refusal made her more valuable and more dangerous. At 25, she was an eccentric. At 30, she was a concern. At 35, she was a crisis. The family fortune was locked inside a woman who would not unlock it according to the rules. Her strategy became clear in 1876. If she could not avoid marriage entirely, she would marry an entity that could never legally consummate the union and claim her fortune. She chose the Catholic Church. Not as a nun, which would have required surrendering her wealth to the order, but as a laywoman of such extraordinary devotion and philanthropy that she became functionally untouchable. She began donating to Catholic hospitals, then orphanages, then schools. Each donation came with her name attached, building a public identity as a charitable saint, while quietly establishing legal frameworks that moved her money beyond her family's reach. In 1884, she funded the construction of a new maternity hospital on the Lower East Side. Cost: $200,000. The hospital bore her name. The board of directors included 3 bishops and a cardinal. Her family could not touch it without declaring war on the church itself. In 1887, she established an orphanage in the Bronx. Cost: $300,000. Again, her name. Again, church protection. By 1890, she had redirected over $1 million of her inheritance into Catholic institutions, and each one a fortress that kept the money out of a husband's hands. The family retaliated. Her brothers challenged her mental competency, claiming religious mania. The case was dismissed. Her cousins spread rumors that she was secretly funding a convent where she kept a mistress. The rumors had no evidence and less impact. Annie had built a defensive wall of bishops and newspaper editors who praised her as the greatest Catholic philanthropist in New York. To attack her was to attack the church. Her family could not afford that war. In 1893, Pope Leo XIII awarded her the Laetare Medal, making her the first American woman to receive a papal honor. The ceremony took place in Rome. Annie stood in the Vatican, draped in black lace, and received a blessing that functionally ended her family's campaign to marry her off. She was 48 years old. She had outlasted them. Every dollar of her $4 million remained under her control, redirected not to a husband, but to institutions that would bear her name long after her family forgot hers. The cost was loneliness of a particular kind. She lived in a mansion on Fifth Avenue, attended by servants, visited by priests, but never by family, except when they needed money. She had won the war, but lost the dynasty. That was the trade she made, and she made it knowing exactly what it would cost. By Chapter 3, The Blueprint for Escape. By 1888, Annie had perfected the art of weaponized charity, and other heiresses were taking notes. The blueprint was elegant. First, establish a public persona as a selfless benefactor. Flood the newspapers with stories of your generosity. Make yourself so beloved by the public that any family attack looks like cruelty toward a saint. Second, move your money into irrevocable charitable trusts. Not gifts, which could be challenged, but legal structures designed to exist in perpetuity. Third, stack the boards of these institutions with powerful men who owe you loyalty. Bishops, judges, newspaper owners, politicians. Create a network of protection that operates outside your family's influence. Fourth, and most critically, never apologize. Never frame your refusal to marry as a personal failing or a religious calling that requires pity. Frame it as a superior choice. When Society columnists asked why she remained unmarried, Annie did not cite shyness or disappointment. She said she had found a higher purpose. She said marriage would have diminished her capacity to do God's work. She said it with such conviction that arguing against her became arguing against God. The legal mechanics were complex but effective. Annie worked with a lawyer named Thomas Egan, himself a devout Catholic, who understood that charitable trusts established before marriage could not be dissolved by a husband after marriage. The trusts were irrevocable. Once the money entered them, it could only be spent according to the terms Annie had dictated. Even if she married later, even if she died, the trusts continued. Her fortune was locked inside institutions that would outlive her family's objections. By 1895, she had established 9 separate trusts. Total value, $2.6 million. In each trust funded a specific institution, a hospital, an orphanage, a school for immigrant children. Each institution employed hundreds of people. Each institution served thousands. The political cost of dismantling them was greater than the financial benefit of reclaiming the money. Annie had turned her inheritance into a public good so thoroughly integrated into New York's social infrastructure that attacking it meant attacking the city itself. Other heiresses studied her model. Margaret Chandler, daughter of a real estate fortune, began redirecting her inheritance to educational trusts in 1892. Catherine Drexel, worth $14 million, founded an order of nuns dedicated to serving Black and Native American communities, moving her entire fortune beyond her family's control in 1891. They were not isolated eccentrics. They were part of a deliberate movement of women who understood that charity was the only legal weapon available to them. The strategy had limits. It required enormous wealth to begin with, wealth large enough that even after redirection, enough remained for personal security. It required a willingness to live alone, or at least outside traditional family structures. And it required a specific kind of ruthlessness, the ability to watch your brothers beg for money you had moved into institutions they could never access and say no. Annie had that ruthlessness. In 1896, her youngest brother asked her to loan him $50,000 to cover gambling debts. She refused. He threatened to challenge her competency again. She reminded him that she had 3 cardinals and the mayor of New York on her hospital boards. He never asked again. She had built a fortress not just around her money, but around herself. The fortune was no longer locked inside a marriageable woman. The fortune was locked inside institutions that required her death to even begin accessing, and even then, only according to her terms. This was her legacy at the peak of her power. Not a husband, not children, not a dynasty, but a series of buildings with her name carved into the stone. Buildings that served the poor while keeping her wealthy relatives at a permanent distance. She had transformed refusal into architecture. Every orphan housed, every mother treated, every child educated was proof that marriage was not the only way for a woman to matter. It was proof that a woman's fortune, kept under her own control, could build something larger than a family tree. The question was whether other women could replicate her success, or whether her particular combination of wealth, religion, and timing was unrepeatable. The answer would come from women who chose different battlefields. Chapter 4: The rumors they invented to break her. The whisper campaign against Annie Leary began in Newport drawing rooms and ended in medical journals diagnosing her spinsterhood as disease. The first rumors were almost quaint. In 1882, society columns began referring to her as excessively pious, code for suspicion that she cared more about saints than suitors. By 1885, the language had sharpened. She was described as having a masculine aversion to matrimony, an unseemly independence of spirit, a coldness toward the natural affections. These were not compliments. These were diagnoses framed as observations. The medical establishment provided the vocabulary. In 1886, Dr. William Hammond published a paper titled "The Disease of Spinsterhood," arguing that unmarried women over 30 suffered from a specific pathology caused by sexual frustration and thwarted maternal instinct. Symptoms included religious mania, charitable obsession, emotional coldness, and a preference for female companionship. Treatment: immediate marriage or, failing that, institutionalization to prevent the condition from worsening into full hysteria. Annie became a case study without her consent. Medical journals referenced the unnamed heiress who had rejected 17 marriage proposals and redirected millions to the church, suggesting this behavior indicated advanced moral insanity. The logic was circular and absolute. A woman who refused marriage was mentally ill by definition, because a sane woman would naturally desire a husband. Therefore, any woman who claimed she did not want to marry was either lying or diseased. The rumors about lesbianism came later, and they came viciously. In 1891, a Newport gossip sheet published a blind item about a certain Catholic heiress who kept suspiciously close company with the nuns at her funded orphanage. The item suggested midnight visits, inappropriate affections, relationships that exceeded Christian charity. No names were used. Everyone knew who they meant. The accusation was strategic. If Annie was a spinster by choice, she was dangerous. If Annie was a spinster because she was sexually deviant, she was pathetic. The rumor reframed her power as perversion. It did not matter whether the rumor was true. What mattered was that it made her unmarried status explain itself in terms society could manage. She was not a woman who had chosen independence. She was a woman who could not function normally. Annie never directly addressed the rumors. To acknowledge them would be to legitimize them as questions worth answering. Instead, she doubled down on visibility. In 1892, she hosted a reception at her Fifth Avenue mansion for 200 guests, including the Archbishop of New York. She wore diamonds worth $50,000. She gave a speech about the moral duty of wealth. She was photographed surrounded by bishops and senators. The message was clear. These are the men who validate me. and they have more power than your gossip. But the rumors had done their work. By 1895, the narrative around Annie had split. To progressive reformers and Catholic newspapers, she was a model of female philanthropy, proof that unmarried women could contribute to society in ways that exceeded domestic service. To society columnists and medical experts, she was a cautionary tale, proof that excessive wealth in the hands of a woman without a husband's guidance led to eccentricity at best, pathology at worst. The pseudoscience was particularly brutal. Dr. Charles Dana, writing in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease in 1897, proposed a new diagnosis: masculine protest syndrome, a condition affecting wealthy unmarried women who rejected their natural role. Symptoms included financial independence and a refusal of male authority and investment in public works rather than private family. The cure was forced marriage, or, if the patient was beyond marriageable age, permanent supervision by male relatives. These were not fringe theories. These were mainstream medical opinions published in respected journals and cited in court cases when families tried to have unmarried daughters declared incompetent. The diagnosis created a legal pathway. If spinsterhood was a disease, then unmarried heiresses were by definition mentally unfit to control their own fortunes. Male relatives could petition for guardianship, claiming they were protecting the woman from herself. Annie avoided this fate because she had built her fortress early. By the time the medical establishment turned spinsterhood into pathology, she had already moved too much of her fortune into irrevocable trusts. There was nothing to seize. But the rumors followed her until her death. Every charitable donation was reinterpreted as evidence of mania. Every refusal to attend a society wedding was cited as proof of her unnatural coldness. She was never allowed to simply be a woman who had chosen a different life. She had to be explained, diagnosed, and dismissed. The social cost was immeasurable. Families stopped inviting her to events where marriage might be discussed, which meant most events. Former friends distanced themselves, worried that association with her would taint their own daughter's marriageability. She became a ghost in her own social class, visible but untouchable, wealthy but alone. The fortune she had fought to keep became the walls of a prison she had built herself. Yet she never recanted. In 1900, a journalist asked her if she regretted never marrying. She said she regretted nothing. She said marriage would have made her a footnote in another family's history, and instead she had written her own. The journalist described her tone as defiant, her manner as unnaturally composed. The article ran under the headline, "The Spinster Who Thinks She Won." Chapter 5. When Arabella Worsham played both sides and won. Arabella Worsham understood that some women could afford to be spinsters because they had already been wives and widows first. She married at 17 in 1854 to a man whose name history barely remembers. He was respectable, briefly wealthy, and conveniently mortal. When he died in 1864, Arabella was 27, childless, and in possession of enough money to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. More importantly, she was in possession of something no unmarried woman could claim: legal independence. As a widow, she could own property, she could sign contracts, she could sue and be sued. The law recognized her as a person. She used that status like a weapon. In 1869, she became the mistress of Collis Huntington, one of the Big Four railroad magnates who had built the Central Pacific and controlled the Southern Pacific. Huntington was married, powerful, and worth approximately $70 million. Arabella was patient. When Huntington's wife died in 1883, Arabella waited exactly long enough for decency, then married him in 1884. The marriage contract was strategic genius. Arabella's lawyers negotiated terms that protected her existing property and guaranteed her a share of Huntington's estate, even if the marriage ended in divorce or annulment. She was not entering the marriage as a piece of property to be absorbed. She was entering as a partner with defined legal rights. When Huntington died in 1900, Arabella inherited approximately $30 million outright, plus controlling interest in railroad stocks, real estate in Manhattan, and a mansion on Fifth Avenue that occupied an entire city block. Then she did something scandalous. She refused to remarry. At 63, wealthy beyond comprehension, she became the most eligible widow in America. Suitors appeared immediately, two men who saw $30 million and convinced themselves they saw love. Arabella rejected them all. She had been a wife twice, she had performed the role to perfection, and she was done. The fortune was hers, earned through decades of strategic patience, and she would not hand it to a third husband simply because society expected her to need male supervision. Her stepchildren erupted. Collis Huntington's son from his first marriage, also named Collis, believed he should have inherited the bulk of the estate. He believed Arabella had manipulated his aging father, perhaps poisoned him, certainly seduced him into rewriting his will. In his mind, the $30 million was stolen property, and his father's widow was a gold digger who had executed the longest con in Gilded Age history. Arabella's response was to consolidate power. She took her seat on the Southern Pacific Board of Directors, one of the few women to hold such a position. She began buying art, not as decoration, but as investment, assembling one of the finest private collections in America. Vermeer, Rembrandt, Van Dyck, each painting worth hundreds of thousands. She was not spending the fortune frivolously. She was converting railroad stock into cultural capital, building a legacy that would outlast her stepson's fury. She also did something Annie Leary had never needed to do. She fought back in the press. When society columnists suggested she was too old to manage such wealth alone, she gave an interview to the New York Times. She explained in precise detail how she had managed Collis Huntington's household for 16 years, overseeing staff of 30, budgets in the hundreds of thousands, in social obligations that functioned as business negotiations. She said any man who thought she could not manage money was welcome to examine her account books and then apologize. The interview was reprinted in newspapers across the country. It was shocking, not because of what she said, but because she said it at all. Wealthy widows were expected to be demure, grateful, and silent. Arabella was none of these things. She was a woman who had married for money, waited for death, inherited the reward, and now refused to pretend the transaction had been anything other than what it was. Her stepson could not tolerate it. In 1902, he filed a lawsuit claiming undue influence, mental incompetence, and possible poisoning. The case would determine whether a widow had the right to keep what her husband left her, or whether adult children could overrule a will simply by questioning the widow's motives. The stakes were enormous: $30 million, control of the Southern Pacific Railroad, ownership of a mansion that would later become the site of the Frick collection. But beyond the money, the case was a test of whether widowhood granted real independence or just temporary custody. Could a woman be trusted with a fortune, or was she always just a vessel waiting for the next man to claim it? Arabella prepared for war. She hired the best lawyers in New York. She gathered evidence of her husband's mental clarity until the day he died. She prepared to testify under oath about every detail of their marriage, every conversation about the will, every witness to his decision. She was 75 years old, and she was about to defend her right to exist as a financially independent woman in open court. The world was watching, and her stepson was certain he would win. Chapter 6. The day her stepson sued for his inheritance. In 1902, Collis Huntington's son filed papers claiming Arabella had poisoned his father to steal the Southern Pacific Railroad. The lawsuit was 90 pages long. It accused Arabella of systematic manipulation beginning in 1884, when she allegedly seduced the elder Huntington while he was grieving his first wife. It claimed she had isolated him from his family, controlled his access to information, and influenced him to rewrite his will multiple times, each revision increasing her share and decreasing theirs. The final accusation was the most serious, that she had administered poison in small doses during the last months of his life, hastening his death to prevent him from changing the will again. The evidence was circumstantial and desperate. The younger Collis presented testimony from servants who claimed Arabella personally prepared her husband's meals and dismissed any staff who questioned her. He presented letters from family members expressing concern about the elder Huntington's declining health and increased dependence on his wife. He presented the will itself, which left Arabella $30 million and the stepchildren $5 million each, as proof that no rational man would favor a second wife so dramatically over his own blood. Arabella's legal team, led by attorney Joseph Choate, dismantled the case methodically. First, they established that the elder Huntington had been examined by 3 separate physicians in the weeks before his death, and all had declared him mentally sound. Second, they produced the original will from 1884, showing that Arabella's share had actually decreased over the years as Huntington made provisions for various charities, not increased as the lawsuit claimed. Third, they presented testimony from business partners who confirmed that Huntington had discussed his estate plans openly and had explicitly stated his intention to leave the bulk of his fortune to his wife, who had earned it through her partnership. The poisoning allegation collapsed under basic scrutiny. The elder Huntington had died of heart failure at age 78, a common cause of death for men his age. No autopsy had been performed because no one had suspected foul play at the time. The younger Collis could produce no medical evidence, no witnesses to poisoning, no motive beyond the obvious. Arabella benefited from her husband's death. Therefore, she must have caused it. The logic was circular and legally insufficient. But the trial was not really about evidence. It was about whether a jury of men could accept that a woman had legitimately earned a fortune, or whether they needed to believe she had stolen it. Arabella understood this. When she took the stand, she did not perform grief or weakness. She performed competence. She testified for 6 hours. She described the financial structure of the Huntington estate in detail, explaining which assets were liquid, which were tied to railroad stock, which were held in trust. She walked the jury through her role in managing the household, the staff, the social obligations that functioned as business networking. She explained that her husband had valued her judgment precisely because she understood money as a tool, not a mystery. She said he had told her repeatedly that she was the only person he trusted to preserve his legacy after his death. The opposing attorney tried to break her. He asked if she had married for love. She said she had married for security and companionship. and that love had developed within that framework. He asked if she had known how wealthy Huntington was when she married him. She said of course she had known, and that pretending otherwise would be dishonest. He asked if she thought it was appropriate for a woman to inherit more than a man's own children. She said she thought it was appropriate for a man to leave his fortune to whomever had earned his trust, and that she had earned it through 16 years of partnership. The courtroom was silent. She had refused to apologize for being strategic. She had refused to pretend the marriage had been a fairy tale. She had described it as a transaction between equals, and she had dared them to punish her for telling the truth. The jury deliberated for 8 days. The verdict came back on a cold morning in March 1903. They found in Arabella's favor on all counts. The will stood. The $30 million was hers. The stepson's claims were dismissed. The judge issued a written opinion stating that widows had the same legal right to inherit as any other heir, and that challenging a will required evidence, not speculation about a woman's character or motives. Arabella left the courthouse without speaking to the press. She returned to her mansion and continued the work she had already begun, converting the fortune into art. Over the next decade, she would spend $15 million on paintings and sculptures, building a collection that would eventually form the core of the Huntington Library and Art Gallery in California. The money her stepson claimed she had stolen would become a public institution that educated millions. But the victory was incomplete. The trial had exposed her to public scrutiny of the most intimate kind. Every detail of her marriage, her finances, her motives had been examined and judged. The newspapers called her the widow who would not weep, the woman who married millions, the gold digger who won. Even in victory, she could not escape the narrative that her wealth was suspicious, her independence unnatural, her refusal to remarry an insult to femininity itself. She lived another 21 years until 1924. She never remarried. She never apologized. She spent the fortune exactly as she chose, and when she died, she left it to institutions and charities, not to the stepchildren who had tried to take it from her. Her will was 12 pages long and airtight. There were no challenges. She had learned from the First War and made sure there would not be a second. Chapter 7. The women who called themselves married to each other. Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Adams Fields didn't call it a Boston marriage because that would have required acknowledging what everyone already knew. They met in 1869 at a literary salon in Boston. Sarah was 20, just beginning her career as a writer. Annie was 35, recently widowed, and the hostess of the most influential literary gathering in New England. The attraction was intellectual first, then emotional, then something neither of them named in letters that might be read by family. By 1874, Sarah had moved into Annie's home on Charles Street. They called it a practical arrangement. Sarah needed a quiet place to write. Annie needed companionship in the enormous house her husband had left her. They shared meals, shared friends, shared a bed that was explained as economy in heating costs during Boston winters. Their friends knew, their families knew. The knowing was polite and unspoken, a conspiracy of willful blindness that allowed the relationship to exist as long as it remained publicly undefined. The financial arrangement was equally unspoken and more complex. Annie had inherited approximately $80,000 from her husband, the publisher James T. Fields, along with the house and his literary estate. Sarah earned money from her writing, but not enough to support herself independently. They pooled resources without formalizing the partnership, because formalizing it would require language that did not exist in legal contracts. They were not business partners. They were not married. They were two women sharing a household in a way that society permitted, as long as no one examined it too closely. The Boston marriage was an institution built on this ambiguity. It allowed unmarried or widowed women to live together, share expenses, and create domestic partnerships that mimicked marriage without the legal submission marriage required. It was a shelter, a compromise, and a trap. The women who entered Boston marriages gained companionship and financial stability. They lost any claim to normalcy, any hope of social acceptance beyond a narrow circle of sympathetic intellectuals, and any ability to defend themselves against the accusations that inevitably followed. For Sarah and Annie, the accusations came in whispers. They were too affectionate in public. They held hands during walks on the common. They finished each other's sentences at dinner parties. Their friends described them as devoted, inseparable, romantic in the 19th century sense of the word, which meant everything and nothing. The word lesbian existed, but only in medical texts and obscene literature. Polite society had no vocabulary for women who loved women, so it borrowed the language of intense friendship and pretended not to notice when the friendship looked like marriage. The literary salon gave them cover. Annie's home became the gathering place for writers, publishers, reformers, and intellectuals. Nathaniel Hawthorne had visited. Harriet Beecher Stowe had dined there. The house carried cultural prestige that protected its occupants. To attack Annie and Sarah was to attack Boston's literary establishment, and few were willing to pay that price. But the protection was conditional. It required Sarah and Annie to perform respectability in every other aspect of their lives. They attended church. They dressed conservatively. They avoided scandal, avoided politics that were too radical, avoided any behavior that might confirm what their critics suspected. They lived in a glass house, constantly watched, constantly judged, constantly aware that one misstep would shatter the illusion that allowed them to exist. The intimacy they created within those constraints was its own form of rebellion. They wrote letters to each other even when they were in the same house, letters that documented the mundane details of shared life. Who would buy the groceries? Whose turn it was to host the salon? What book they were reading together before bed. The letters were not passionate in the way lovers' letters are supposed to be passionate. They were tender in a way that assumed permanence, that assumed the reader would be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. In 1882, Sarah published a story called The Courting of Sister Wasby, about two women who lived together as companions and described themselves as more necessary to each other than husbands ever were. Critics praised it as a charming tale of female friendship. Sarah never confirmed what the story actually was, a love letter published in plain sight to the woman she lived with. The money they shared allowed them a life that most women, married or unmarried, could not access. They traveled together to Europe. They bought books and art. They funded younger writers and artists. They created a household that functioned as a salon, a library, a sanctuary, and a marriage in everything but name. The wealth was not enormous by Gilded Age standards, but it was enough to buy privacy, and privacy was the currency that allowed them to love each other without asking permission. But wealth could not protect them from everything. In 1885, Annie's cousins began asking questions about her will. Who would inherit the house? Who would inherit the literary estate? The expectation was that Annie would leave everything to family, blood relations who had a legal claim. The fear was that she would leave it to Sarah, which would confirm what the cousins had always suspected and could never prove. The will became a weapon before Annie was even dead, and the question it forced was one Boston marriages could never fully answer. If two women built a life together, who owned it when one of them died? Chapter 8. The inheritance that required heterosexuality. When Annie Fields's father died in 1876, his will contained one clause that turned inheritance into a test of sexual compliance. The clause was buried in the middle of a standard estate document. It stated that Annie would continue to receive income from the family trust on the condition that she maintained a respectable household. Respectable was undefined, which meant it was infinitely flexible, which meant it was a trap. If Annie's cousins decided her household was not respectable, they could petition the trustee to withhold her income. The trustee was Annie's uncle, a man who had already expressed concern about her unnaturally close friendship with that writer woman. The threat was clear. If Annie wanted the money, she needed to distance herself from Sarah. If she refused, she risked losing the income that allowed her to maintain the house, the salon, the life they had built. The will was designed to enforce heterosexuality without ever using that word, because using that word would require acknowledging what it was trying to prevent. Annie's response was to build legal structures that made the threat unenforceable. She worked with a lawyer named George Hale, who understood that trusts could be challenged, but only if the challenger could prove actual harm. Annie began redirecting her income the moment she received it. She donated to charities. She established a fund for young writers. She used the money so publicly and so respectably that challenging her would require arguing that charity was disrespectable, which no one could do with a straight face. She also rewrote her own will, the one that would control what happened to her estate when she died. Instead of leaving everything to Sarah directly, which would invite a challenge, she created a life estate. Sarah would have the right to live in the house and use the income from the estate for the rest of her life. After Sarah's death, the property would go to a literary foundation Annie established. The cousins would get nothing, but they would have no grounds to challenge, because Annie was leaving the money to an institution, not to a lover. The strategy worked because it exploited the gap between what society suspected and what it could prove. Annie and Sarah were living as a married couple, but the law did not recognize same-sex marriage, which meant the law had no framework for challenging a same-sex domestic partnership. The cousins could gossip, but they could not sue, because suing would require naming what they were suing about, and naming it would be obscene. Other women in Boston marriages adopted similar strategies. They created joint bank accounts, but kept them technically separate. They bought property together, but titled it in one name with the other listed as heir. They wrote wills that used the language of friendship and gratitude rather than love and partnership. They built legal scaffolding around relationships the law refused to see, using the invisibility as protection. But invisibility came at a cost. In 1886, a cousin of Annie's died and left her estate to a niece on the condition that the niece never enter into a Boston marriage. The will defined the term, any household arrangement between two unmarried women that resembles matrimony in its exclusivity and domestic character. It was the first time the phrase appeared in a legal document, and it was used as a disqualification, not a recognition. The niece challenged the clause as unenforceable and lost. The court ruled that a testator had the right to impose moral conditions on inheritance, and that Boston marriages, while not illegal, were sufficiently irregular to justify exclusion. The ruling sent a message to every heiress in a Boston marriage. Your family can cut you off, and the courts will allow it. The law would not punish you for loving a woman, but it would not protect you either. You were on your own. Sarah and Annie tightened their defenses. They adopted a young writer named Margaret Deland, in giving them a legal daughter who could inherit in ways a partner could not. The adoption was strategic and genuine. Margaret lived with them, learned from them, and eventually became a successful novelist herself. When Annie died, Margaret would serve as literary executor, ensuring that the estate passed according to Annie's wishes rather than her family's demands. In 1890, Annie established the Fields Literary Fund, endowing it with $20,000. The fund provided grants to struggling writers, with preference given to women. The charter stated that the fund would be managed by a board of trustees appointed by Annie during her lifetime, and by Sarah after Annie's death. It was a legal mechanism that gave Sarah power and income without giving her ownership, because ownership would be challengeable in ways management was not. The cousins understood what was happening. They were being systematically cut out of an inheritance they believed was theirs by blood. But every move Annie made was legal, public, and defensible. She was not hiding her money in offshore accounts. She was not transferring it secretly. She was simply directing it toward people and institutions she valued more than family, and the law allowed that, barely. The tension built slowly, inevitably, toward a breaking point. In 1891, the cousins decided that if they could not challenge Annie's financial decisions, they would challenge Annie herself. If she was mentally incompetent, her decisions were void. And if her decisions were void, the money went to her legal heirs. Them. They arrived on a Tuesday evening with a judge's signature and two doctors who had never met Annie but were prepared to diagnose her anyway. Chapter 9. The night Boston society tried to separate them. In 1891, Annie's cousins arrived at her Beacon Hill home with two doctors and commitment papers signed by a judge. The legal mechanism was simple. Massachusetts law allowed family members to petition for the involuntary commitment of a relative if two physicians certified that the person was a danger to themselves or others, or mentally incapable of managing their own affairs. The physicians did not need to examine the patient extensively. They needed only to sign a certificate stating their professional opinion. Once signed, and the certificate gave legal authority to remove the person from their home and place them in an asylum for observation, which could last weeks or months while the commitment was evaluated. Annie's cousins had chosen their moment carefully. Sarah was in Maine, visiting her own family. Annie was alone in the house except for servants, who could be intimidated or bribed into silence. The cousins arrived at 7 in the evening, after dark, when neighbors would not see. They brought the two doctors, both men, both respected physicians with privileges at McLean Hospital, the private asylum where wealthy Bostonians sent relatives who had become inconvenient. The lead cousin, a man named Edward, explained the situation to Annie as if she were a child. She had been behaving erratically. She had been making unwise financial decisions. She had been living in an inappropriate arrangement that suggested moral and mental decay. For her own protection, they were taking her to McLean for a rest and evaluation. The doctors would examine her, and if she was found competent, she would be released. If not, a conservator would be appointed to manage her affairs. Annie understood immediately. This was not about her health. This was about the will, the trust, the money flowing toward Sarah and literary foundations instead of toward blood relatives. The commitment was a legal tool to void every decision she had made. Once declared incompetent, her will would be invalid. The life estate would be invalid. The literary fund would be invalid. Everything would revert to the default. Family inheritance, male control, the erasure of the life she had built. She asked to see the commitment papers. Edward handed them over. The physician's certificates stated that Miss Annie Adams Fields exhibited symptoms of monomania, an obsessive fixation on a single subject to the exclusion of rational thought. The subject was not named, but the implication was clear: Sarah. The certificates claimed Annie had sacrificed her family relationships, her social standing, and her financial security for an unnatural attachment that indicated mental imbalance. The certificates were dated that morning. The physicians had signed them without ever meeting her. Annie did what every woman in her position was taught to do. She stalled. She asked if she could pack a bag. She asked if she could leave a note for Sarah. She asked if she could speak to her own physician. Edward said no to everything. The judge's order was immediate and non-negotiable. She needed to come now. Annie excused herself to use the bathroom. Instead, she went to her study and wrote 3 letters. The first was to Sarah, explaining what was happening and instructing her to contact George Hale, their lawyer. The second was to Hale himself, stating that she was being unlawfully detained and invoking habeas corpus. The third was to the editor of the Boston Evening Transcript, a friend who had attended the salon for years. She described the attempted commitment, named the cousins, named the doctors, and stated that if this letter reached him, it meant she had been forcibly removed from her home on false pretenses. She gave all 3 letters to her housekeeper, a woman named Catherine, who had worked for Annie for 15 years. She told Catherine to wait 1 hour after Annie left, then deliver the letters personally. If anyone tried to stop her, she was to scream for the police. Catherine hid the letters in her apron and nodded. Annie returned to the parlor and told her cousins she was ready. She walked out of her own home, flanked by 2 doctors who had already decided she was insane, climbed into a carriage, and rode toward McLean Hospital, knowing that everything depended on whether Catherine could get those letters delivered before the cousins realized what had happened. The carriage ride took 40 minutes. Annie spent it memorizing the commitment certificate, preparing her defense. At McLean, she was processed like any other patient. Her jewelry was removed. Her clothes were searched. She was given an institutional nightgown and shown to a room with bars on the windows. The door locked from the outside. She was now legally insane, and anything she said to protest would be interpreted as further evidence of her mania. Meanwhile, Catherine delivered the letters. Sarah received hers at 11 that night. Carried by a messenger Catherine had paid from her own wages. Sarah read it once, then rode through the night back to Boston, arriving at George Hale's office at 6 the next morning. By 8, Hale had filed a writ of habeas corpus demanding Annie's immediate release and a hearing on the validity of the commitment. By noon, the Boston Evening Transcript had published Annie's letter on the front page under the headline, "Heiress Imprisoned by Family Seeking Fortune." The scandal was immediate and total. McLean Hospital, which depended on its reputation for discretion, was suddenly the subject of public outrage. How could they accept a commitment based on certificates signed by doctors who had never examined the patient? The cousins, who had expected a quiet family matter, found themselves named in newspapers and accused of conspiracy to defraud. The 2 physicians who had signed the certificates were called before the state medical board to explain their professional conduct. The hearing took place 3 days later. Annie appeared in court dressed in the clothes Sarah had brought her. calm, and articulate. She answered every question the judge asked. She recited poetry. She explained the structure of her literary trust. She described her household finances in detail. She was so obviously competent that the hearing became farcical. The judge asked the physicians to explain their diagnosis. They stammered about moral irregularity and unnatural attachments. The judge asked if moral irregularity was a medical diagnosis. They admitted it was not. The commitment was voided. Annie was released. The judge issued a ruling that became precedent. Commitment required actual examination and evidence of specific mental defect, not family disapproval of lifestyle choices. The cousins were ordered to pay court costs. The physicians were censured by the medical board. Annie returned to her home on Charles Street, where Sarah was waiting, and they locked every door, but the damage was done. Annie had been publicly accused of insanity. The newspapers had described her household as irregular, her relationship as unnatural, her choices as evidence of mental weakness. Even in victory, she could not escape the narrative that a woman who loved another woman, who redirected her fortune away from family, who refused to live according to script, was by definition unstable. She never forgot the fear of that night, the powerlessness of being taken from her own home, of being declared incompetent by men who had never spoken to her, of knowing that the law could be weaponized against any woman whose independence threatened male control. She fortified every defense. She rewrote her will again, this time with witnesses from outside her family. She established multiple trustees to prevent any single person from having control. She prepared for the war to continue after her death, because she understood now that it would never truly end. Chapter 10. What they built with the money they kept. By 1900, the women who refused marriage had quietly redirected an estimated $50 million away from husbands and toward institutions that still stand today. The accounting is imprecise because the women were strategic about publicity. Some donations were anonymous. Some were channeled through male trustees to avoid the stigma of female philanthropy. Some were hidden inside family trusts with language so carefully crafted that even the beneficiaries did not know a woman had funded them. But the legacy is measurable in buildings, in endowments, in institutions that survived when the women who created them were forgotten. Annie Leary's fortune, approximately $4 million, built 3 hospitals, 7 orphanages, and 2 homes for unwed mothers. The hospitals still operate in New York City. The orphanages became adoption agencies and foster care systems. The homes for unwed mothers evolved into reproductive health clinics. Her name appears on bronze plaques and cornerstones, but most people who walk past those buildings do not know who she was or why she funded them. They do not know that every brick represents a dollar kept out of a husband's hands, redirected toward women and children who had no other protector. Arabella Huntington's collection, assembled at a cost of $15 million, became the foundation of the Huntington Library, Art Gallery, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California. Over 500,000 people visit each year. They see Gainsborough's Blue Boy. They see rare manuscripts and Shakespeare folios. They do not see the woman who spent 2 decades fighting her stepchildren for the right to spend her own inheritance the way she chose. The institution exists because a widow refused to remarry and used her money to build something that could not be inherited or divided or claimed by men who believed it belonged to them by right of relation. The Boston marriage women, collectively, redirected approximately $8 million into literary foundations, educational trusts, and women's colleges. Sarah Orne Jewett's royalties, assigned to a trust after her death, still funds scholarships for women writers. Annie Fields's literary salon, formalized as the Fields Foundation after her death, provided grants to women authors for 30 years. The foundation dissolved in 1930, but the writers it supported, Mary Wilkins Freeman, Sarah Pratt, Alice Brown, went on to publish hundreds of works that might not have existed without that financial support. Catherine Drexel, the heiress who became a nun, redirected her entire $14 million inheritance to founding Xavier University, the only historically Black Catholic university in the United States. She established 50 missions and schools for Native American children across 16 states. When she died in 1955, her order operated 63 schools and foundations, serving over 12,000 students annually. Her canonization as a saint in the year 2000 made her the second American-born saint in Catholic history. The Church celebrated her devotion. It barely acknowledged the financial warfare she had waged against her own family to keep control of the money that funded her work. Margaret Chandler, who studied Annie Leary's blueprint, founded the Sydenham Hospital in Harlem in 1892, one of the first hospitals in New York to treat Black patients without segregation. She funded it with $300,000 from her real estate inheritance, money her brothers had expected to absorb into their own estates when she married. She never married. The hospital operated for 70 years before merging with Harlem Hospital. At its peak, it employed 200 staff and treated 15,000 patients per year. The pattern was consistent. Women who kept control of their fortunes did not hoard them. They weaponized them. They turned inheritance into infrastructure. They built schools where daughters could learn financial management. They built hospitals where women could give birth without dying from neglect. They built libraries where the poor could access the same knowledge as the wealthy. They took the money that was supposed to flow from father to husband to son and redirected it toward people who had been systematically excluded from wealth. This was not charity in the sentimental sense. This was reparations. These women understood that they had inherited fortunes built on exploitation, on railroad labor that killed Chinese immigrants, on factory work that crippled children, on real estate speculation that displaced the poor. They could not undo the harm their fathers had done, but they could redirect the profit. They could take blood money and turn it into bandages. The legal structures they created outlasted their critics. The irrevocable charitable trust became a standard tool for estate planning. The life estate became a way for unmarried partners to protect each other without marriage. The endowment model they perfected, where principal remains untouched and only interest is spent, became the foundation of university and museum funding. Every philanthropic institution in America today operates on frameworks these women helped establish. By 1920, when most of them had died, the total wealth redirected by unmarried heiresses toward charitable institutions was estimated at $70 million. For context, that was more than the annual budget of the city of Boston. It was enough to have built 100 libraries, 50 hospitals, 20 universities. Some of it did exactly that. The rest was absorbed by institutions that erased the donors' names to avoid acknowledging that women had funded them. The erasure was strategic. Institutions wanted the money, but not the association with spinsters, with Boston marriages, with women who had defied their families. Better to accept the donation anonymously than to explain why the benefactor had been unmarried, why she had chosen this institution over family, why her relatives had fought so hard to stop her. Better to take the money and forget the hand that gave it. But the buildings remain, the hospitals treat patients, The scholarships educate students. The libraries lend books. The legacy is concrete even when the names are lost. And that was the final irony. These women fought for the right to control their own fortunes, and then gave most of it away. Yet they did not keep the money. They kept the power to decide what it built. Chapter 11. The erasure that followed their deaths. When Annie Leary died in 1919, her obituary mentioned her charity work, but erased the 40 years she spent refusing every marriage proposal her family arranged. The New York Times obituary was 6 paragraphs long. It described her as a devout Catholic philanthropist who had funded numerous institutions. It mentioned her papal honor. It listed the hospitals and orphanages that bore her name. It did not mention that she had been worth $4 million and had fought her family in court to keep control of it. It did not mention the suitors she refused, the rumors she endured, the campaigns to declare her insane. It described her as a spinster, which was true, but it framed the spinsterhood as incidental rather than defiant. The obituary presented her as a woman who had happened not to marry, not as a woman who had chosen financial autonomy over patriarchal absorption. Her family attended the funeral, the brothers who had challenged her competency, the cousins who had tried to seize her estate. They stood in the church she had funded and accepted condolences for the loss of a beloved relative. None of them mentioned the decades of warfare. None of them acknowledged that they had spent her entire adult life trying to nullify her choices. They performed grief, collected their minimal inheritances from the portions of her estate she had not redirected, and then set about rewriting the family history to exclude the parts that embarrassed them. Within 10 years, family genealogies listed Annie as a maiden aunt who had done charitable work. The specifics were vague. The amounts were omitted. The fact that she had controlled one of the largest personal fortunes in New York was reduced to a footnote, if mentioned at all. Her grandnephews and grandnieces grew up knowing she existed, but not knowing why she mattered. The family had erased her defiance and kept only her respectability. Arabella Huntington's erasure was more complex because her legacy was more visible. When she died in 1924, her art collection was donated to the institution that became the Huntington Library. The institution acknowledged her generosity. It displayed her portrait in the main hall. But the story it told was sanitized. Arabella was presented as a cultured patron of the arts, a woman of refined taste who had assembled a magnificent collection. The institution did not mention the courtroom battles, the accusations of gold digging and murder, the stepchildren who had tried to steal the fortune. It did not mention that she had spent 20 years refusing to remarry, precisely because remarriage would have cost her control of the collection. The curators wanted the art. They did not want the scandal, so they accepted the donation and rewrote the donor. Arabella became a gracious widow, not a strategic warrior. Her life was flattened into a fairy tale. She married a wealthy man. He died. She grieved beautifully. She gave his fortune to noble causes. The $15 million art collection was framed as her husband's legacy, even though she had assembled most of it after his death, using money she had fought to keep. The institution erased her agency to preserve its own respectability. Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Adams Fields faced a different kind of erasure. When Sarah died in 1909, her obituary described her as one of America's finest regional writers. It mentioned that she had lived with Annie Fields, her devoted friend, for 35 years. The word friend was weight-bearing. It carried the entire relationship, compressed it into something respectable, drained it of intimacy. Literary critics writing about Sarah in the decades after her death referred to the friendship as a romantic friendship, a phrase that meant everything and nothing, that acknowledged intensity while denying sexuality. Annie outlived Sarah by 6 years. When Annie died in 1915, her obituary described her as the widow of the famous publisher James T. Fields and as the hostess of the most important literary salon in Boston. It mentioned Sarah as her companion and literary protege. The 40 years they spent as domestic partners, sharing finances and a bed and a life, were reduced to companionship. The legal structures they had built to protect each other were invisible. The commitment attempt, the court battles, the wills carefully crafted to circumvent families, all of it disappeared into the phrase devoted friends. Their letters were edited before publication. Passages that were too intimate, that used language of love and longing, were omitted by literary executors who wanted to preserve the women's reputations. The published versions of their correspondence emphasized their literary work and minimized their emotional life. Scholars reading those edited letters concluded that Sarah and Annie had been close friends, intense perhaps, but fundamentally platonic. The erasure was so effective that it took nearly a century for historians to recover the evidence of what the relationship actually was. The pattern repeated across every case. Women who had fought for financial autonomy were remembered as philanthropists, not as warriors. Their refusal to marry was framed as personal preference, not political act. Their strategic brilliance, the legal frameworks they built, the court battles they won, all of it was erased in favor of a simpler story. They were generous, they were pious, they were kind. The generosity was real, but it was not the whole story. The kindness cost them everything, and the obituaries pretended it had cost them nothing. The institutions they funded participated in the erasure. Hospitals removed donor plaques that mentioned unmarried women, replacing them with plaques that credited the institution itself. Universities renamed scholarships to honor male trustees instead of female benefactors. Libraries cataloged donations as anonymous rather than acknowledge they came from women who had lived in Boston marriages. The money was accepted, the names were removed, and within a generation, the history was lost. By 1950, most of these women had been forgotten outside of specialist academic circles. The buildings remained, but the builders were gone. The fortunes they had controlled were absorbed into institutional budgets and family histories that omitted inconvenient truths. The legal precedents they set were used by other women without knowing who had fought for them. The erasure was so complete that when the women's liberation movement of the 1970s began researching women's history, they had to excavate these stories from archives and court records because the published histories had buried them. The final insult was that the erasure was framed as protection. Families claimed they were preserving the women's dignity by not discussing their private lives. Institutions claimed they were respecting the women's wishes by focusing on their charitable works rather than their personal choices. But dignity and respect were code words. What they meant was, we are erasing the parts of your life that made us uncomfortable and calling it kindness. The women who refused marriage to keep their fortunes were dangerous because they proved that female independence was possible. The erasure was necessary because if their stories survived, other women might follow their example. Better to forget them than to explain why their choices had required such brutality to suppress. Better to accept their money and erase their names than to admit that the war had been real and that they had won. Chapter 12. The Inheritance we forgot they left us. Every woman who controls her own bank account stands on legal ground these heiresses fought to create, whether she knows their names or not. The inheritance is not sentimental, it is structural. The Married Women's Property Acts. It passed state by state between 1840 and 1900, existed on paper, but were rarely enforced until women like Annie Leary and Arabella Huntington sued their families in public courts and forced judges to honor the law. Every court case they won established precedent. Every will they defended made it harder for the next family to challenge the next woman. They turned theoretical rights into practical protections by refusing to accept that theory and practice were different things. The irrevocable charitable trust, now a standard tool in estate planning, was perfected by unmarried heiresses who needed to move money beyond family reach. Before their legal innovations, trusts could be challenged, dissolved, or controlled by male relatives appointed as trustees. After their court battles, trusts became genuinely irrevocable if properly structured. The legal language they developed, tested in courtrooms and refined through appeals, became the template that every estate attorney now uses. When a wealthy person today establishes a foundation that will outlive them, they are using tools these women forged. The life estate, the legal mechanism that allowed Boston marriage couples to protect each other without marriage, became the foundation for domestic partnership law a century later. The structure was simple. One partner retained ownership. The other received the right to use and benefit from the property for life. It was not marriage, but it was legally binding. When domestic partnership laws were drafted in the late 20th century, so lawyers looked back at 19th century life estates and adapted the structure for modern use. The legal protection that Sarah and Annie created for themselves eventually became the protection available to any unmarried couple. The concept of financial independence as a right, not a privilege contingent on male permission, was radical in 1890. These women did not invent the concept, but they made it real. They demonstrated that a woman could manage a fortune, invest it wisely, deploy it strategically, and die having grown it rather than squandered it. They proved that the assumption underlying coverture, that women were naturally incompetent with money, was a lie designed to justify control. The philanthropic model they established, where women funded institutions that served other women and children, created a parallel economy. Before their work, charity was largely a function of churches and male-controlled institutions. After their work, women's philanthropy became its own sector. Women's hospitals, women's colleges, women's clubs, all funded by women who had kept control of inherited wealth and chose to spend it on other women's advancement. That infrastructure still exists. It is woven into the nonprofit sector so thoroughly that we forget it had to be built, and that the women who built it were punished for doing so. But the inheritance is incomplete because the erasure worked. Most women today do not know these names. They do not know that the right to keep earnings after marriage, to own property in their own name, to establish credit without a husband's signature, all of these were fought for by specific women in specific courtrooms against specific families who wanted to preserve patriarchal control. The rights exist, but the memory of the fight is gone. And without memory, rights feel natural rather than contingent, permanent rather than fragile, guaranteed rather than defended. The danger is that what was won can be lost. Legal protections exist until they are challenged and found weak. Court precedents stand until they are overturned. The frameworks these women built assumed that future generations would understand why they mattered and would defend them. But if the history is erased, if the struggle is forgotten, then the next challenge might succeed where the first challenges failed. The deeper inheritance is philosophical. These women were not just refusing marriage, and they were refusing to be currency. In the economy of Gilded Age dynasties, daughters were assets, valuable for their reproductive capacity and their ability to cement alliances through marriage. By refusing marriage, these heiresses rejected their own commodification. They said, "I am not a thing to be traded. I am not a vehicle for someone else's wealth. I am not obligated to produce heirs or expand empires. I am a person with agency, and I choose myself." That refusal was more dangerous than any political manifesto because it was lived rather than theorized. They did not write essays about women's rights. They deployed millions of dollars in ways that made women's autonomy structural rather than rhetorical. They built institutions that educated women, employed women, served women, and in doing so, Yima created alternative pathways to security that did not require marriage. Every woman who attended a women's college funded by these heiresses, every woman who received medical care at a hospital they built, every woman who accessed a scholarship they endowed, benefited from their refusal without knowing it. The question is what we do with that inheritance. Do we acknowledge that financial independence was not granted, but seized, not gifted, but fought for, not inevitable, but contingent on women who were willing to sacrifice family approval, social acceptance, and historical recognition? Do we teach their names to daughters learning about money? Do we tell the truth that the right to control your own bank account came from women who were called insane, deviant, unnatural, and criminal for wanting exactly what every man assumed was his by birthright? Or do we let the erasure continue? Do we accept the sanitized version, where these women were generous philanthropists who happened to be unmarried, where their fortunes were gifts rather than battlefields, where their choices were personal rather than political? Do we pretend that financial independence is natural for women now, forgetting that it was unnatural 100 years ago and required women willing to be called monsters to make it ordinary? The inheritance they left is this: the knowledge that choosing yourself over dynasty is the most radical act available to a woman born into wealth. The knowledge that refusal is a form of power. The knowledge that money, kept under your own control, can build institutions that outlast the families that tried to control you. And the knowledge that the price of that power is loneliness, erasure, and a war that continues after you are dead. Every woman who signs her own name to a bank account, who keeps her own surname after marriage, who writes her own will and defends it against family, who chooses work over childbearing, who invests her own money and watches it grow, who funds causes that matter to her rather than to her relatives, stands on ground these women cleared. They are the unnamed mothers of female financial autonomy. They are the women who refused to be currency and turned themselves into architects instead. And they are forgotten, which means their war is not over, because the final battle in every war is the battle over who gets to tell the story. We owe them memory. We owe them recognition. We owe them the truth that they were not lucky or eccentric or accidentally independent. They were strategic, brilliant, ruthless, and willing to pay the price that autonomy demanded. And if we forget them, if we let the erasure stand, then we have accepted the logic that erased them. That women who choose themselves over family are embarrassments to be hidden rather than warriors to be honored. That is the inheritance we forgot they left us. And forgetting it is the final betrayal.